Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss, and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight, stand like druids of eld, with voices sad and prophetic, stand like harpers hoar, with beards that rest on their bosoms. Loud from its rocky caverns, the deep-voiced neighboring ocean speaks, and in accents disconsolate answers the wail of the forest. This is the forest primeval, but where are the hearts that beneath it leaped like the roe, when he hears in the woodland the voice of the huntsman? Where is the thatch-roofed village, the home of Acadian farmers, men whose lives glided on like rivers that water the woodlands, darkened by shadows of earth, but reflecting an image of heaven? Waste are those pleasant farms, and the farmers forever departed, scattered like dust and leaves, when the mighty blasts of October seize them and whirl them aloft and sprinkle them far o'er the ocean. Naught but tradition remains of the beautiful village of Grand Prix. He who believes in affection that hopes and endures and is patient, he who believe in the beauty and strength of woman's devotion, list to the mournful tradition still sung by the pines of the forest, list to a tale of love in Acadie, home of the happy. Part the First. 1. In the Acadian land, on the shores of the basin of Minas, distant, secluded, still, the little village of Grand Prix lay in the fruitful valley. Vast meadows stretched to the eastward, giving the village its name, and pasture to flocks without number. Dikes that the hands of the farmers had raised with labor incessant shut out the turbulent tides, but at stated seasons the floodgates opened, and welcomed the sea to wander at will o'er the meadows. West and south there were fields of flax, and orchards and cornfields spreading afar and unfenced o'er the plain, and away to the northward Blomidon rose, and the forests old, and aloft on the mountain sea fogs pitched their tents, and mists from the mighty Atlantic looked on the happy valley, but ne'er from their station descended. There, in the midst of its farms, reposed the Acadian village. Strongly built were the houses, with frames of oak and of hemlock, such as the peasants of Normandy built in the reign of the Henrys. Thatched were the roofs, with dormer windows, and gables projecting over the basement below protected and shaded the doorway. There in the tranquil evenings of summer, when brightly the sunset lighted the village street and gilded the vanes on the chimneys, matrons and maidens sat in snow-white caps and in kirtles scarlet and blue and green, with distaffs spinning the golden flax for the gossiping looms, whose noisy shuttles within doors mingled their sound with the whir of the wheels and the songs of the maidens. Solemnly down the street came the parish priest, and the children paused in their play to kiss the hand he extended to bless them. Reverend walked he among them, and up rose matrons and maidens, hailing his slow approach with words of affectionate welcome. Then came the laborers home from the field, and serenely the sun sank down to his rest, and twilight prevailed. Anon from the belfry softly the angelus sounded, and over the roofs of the village columns of pale blue smoke, like clouds of incense ascending, rose from 100 hearths, the homes of peace and contentment. Thus dwelt together in love these simple Acadian farmers, dwelt in the love of God and of man. Alike were they free from fear that reigns with the tyrant, and envy, the vice of republics. Neither locks had they to their doors, nor bars to their windows, but their dwellings were open as day in the hearts of their owners. There the richest was poor, and the poorest lived in abundance. Somewhat apart from the village, and nearer the basin of Minas, Benedict Bellefontaine, the wealthiest farmer of Grand Prix, dwelt on his goodly acres, and with him, directing his household, gentle Evangeline lived, his child, and the pride of the village. Stalwart and stately in form was the man of 70 winters, hardy and hale was he, an oak that is covered with snowflakes. White as the snow were his locks, and his cheeks as brown as the oak leaves. Fair was she to behold, that maiden of 17 summers. Black were her eyes as the berry that grows on the thorn by the wayside. Black, yet how softly they gleamed beneath the brown shade of her tresses. Sweet was her breath as the breath of kine that feed in the meadows. When in the harvest heat she bore to the reapers at noontide flagons of home-brewed ale. Ah, fair in sooth was the maiden, fairer was she when, on Sunday morn, while the bell from its turret sprinkled with holy sounds the air, as the priest with his hyssop sprinkles the congregation, and scatters blessings upon them, down the long street she passed, with her chaplet of beads and her missal, wearing her Norman cap and her kirtle of blue, and the earrings, brought in the olden time from France, and since, as an heirloom, handed down down from mother to child through long generations, but a celestial brightness, a more ethereal beauty, shone on her face and encircled her form when, after confession, homeward serenely she walked with God's benediction upon her. When she had passed, it seemed like the ceasing of exquisite music. Firmly builded with rafters of oak, the house of the farmer stood on the side of a hill commanding the sea, and a shady sycamore grew by the door with a woodbine wreathing around it. Rudely carved was the porch, with seats beneath, and a footpath led through an orchard wide, and disappeared in the meadow. Under the sycamore tree were eaves overhung by a penthouse, such as the traveler sees in regions remote by the roadside, built or a box for the poor, or the blessed image of Mary. Farther down, on the slope of the hill, was the well with its moss-grown bucket fastened with iron, and near it a trough for the horses, shielding the house from storms. On the north were the barns and the farmyard. There stood the broad-wheeled wains and the antique plows and the harrows. There were the folds for the sheep, and there, in his feathered seraglio, strutted the lordly turkey, and crowed the cock with the self-same voice that in ages of old had startled the penitent Peter. Bursting with hay were the barns, themselves a village. In each one far o'er the gable projected a roof of thatch, and a staircase under the sheltering eaves led up to the odorous corn loft. There too the dovecot stood, with its meek and innocent inmates murmuring ever of love, while above in the variant breezes numberless noisy weathercocks rattled and sang of mutation. Thus, at peace with God and the world, the farmer of Grand Pré lived on his sunny farm, and Evangeline governed his household. Many a youth, as he knelt in the church and opened his missal, fixed his eyes upon her as the saint of his deepest devotion. Happy was he who might touch her hand or the hem of her garment. Many a suitor came to her door, by the darkness befriended, and, as he knocked and waited to hear the sound of her footsteps, knew not which beat the louder, his heart or the knocker of iron, or at the joyous feast of the patron saint of the village. Bolder grew, and pressed her hand in the dance as he whispered hurried words of love that seemed a part of the music. But among all who came, young Gabriel only was welcome. Gabriel Lajeunesse, the son of Basil the blacksmith, who was a mighty man in the village, and honored of all men, for, since the birth of time, throughout all ages and nations, has the craft of the smith been held in repute by the people. Basil was Benedict's friend. Their children from earliest childhood grew up together as brother and sister, and Father Felician, priest and pedagogue both in the village, had taught them their letters out of the self-same book, with the hymns of the church and the plain song. But when the hymn was sung, and the daily lesson completed, swiftly they hurried away to the forge of Basil the blacksmith. There at the door they stood, with wondering eyes to behold him take in his leathern lap the hoof of the horse as a plaything, nailing the shoe in its place, while near him the tire of the cartwheel lay like a fiery snake, coiled round in a circle of cinders. Oft on autumnal eves, when without in the gathering darkness bursting with light seemed the smithy, through every cranny and crevice, warm by the forge within they watched the laboring bellows, and as its panting ceased, and the sparks expired in the ashes, merrily laughed, and said they were nuns going into the chapel. Oft on sledges in winter, as swift as the swoop of the eagle, down the hillside hounding, they glided away o'er the meadow. Oft in the barns they climbed to the populous nests on the rafters, seeking with eager eyes that wondrous stone, which the swallow brings from the shore of the sea to restore the sight of its fledglings. Lucky was he who found that stone in the nest of the swallow. Thus passed a few swift years, and they no longer were children. He was a valiant youth, and his face, like the face of the morning, gladdened the earth with its light, and ripened thought into action. She was a woman now, with the ardent hopes of a woman. Sunshine of St. Eulalie was she called, for that was the sunshine which, as the farmers believed, would load their orchards with apples. She, too, would bring to her husband's house delight and abundance, filling it full of love and the ruddy faces of children. 2. Now at the season returned, when the nights grow colder and longer, and the retreating sun the sign of the scorpion enters. Birds of passage sailed through the leaden air, from the ice-bound, desolate northern bays to the shores of tropical islands. Harvests were gathered in, and wild with the winds of September wrestled the trees of the forest, as Jacob of old with the angel. All the signs foretold a winter long and inclement. Bees, with prophetic instinct of want, had hoarded their honey till the hives overflowed. and the Indian hunters asserted cold would the winter be, for thick was the fur of the foxes. Such was the advent of autumn. Then followed that beautiful season, called by the pious Acadian peasants the summer of All Saints. Filled was the air with a dreamy and magical light, and the landscape lay as if new created in all the freshness of childhood. Peace seemed to reign upon earth, and the restless heart of the ocean was for a moment consoled. All sounds were in harmony blended. Voices of children at play, the crowing of cocks in the farmyard, swirr of wings in the drowsy air, and the cooing of pigeons, all were subdued and low as the murmurs of love, and the great sun looked with the eye of love through the golden vapors around him, while arrayed in its robes of russet and scarlet and yellow, bright with the sheen of the dew, each glittering tree of the forest flashed like the plane tree, the Persian adorned with mantles and jewels. Now recommenced the reign of rest and affection and stillness. Day with its burden and heat had departed, and twilight descending brought back the evening star to the sky, and the herds to the homestead. Pawing the ground they came, and resting their necks on each other, and with their nostrils distended inhaling the freshness of evening. Foremost, bearing the bell, Evangeline's beautiful heifer, proud of her snow-white hide, and the ribbon that waved from her collar, quietly paced and slow, as if conscious of human affection. Then came the shepherd back with his bleating flocks from the seaside, where was their favorite pasture. Behind them followed the watchdog, patient, full of importance, and grand in the pride of his instinct, walking from side to side with a lordly air, and superbly waving his bushy tail, and urging forward the stragglers. Regent of flocks was he when the shepherd slept, their protector when from the forest at night, through the starry silence, the wolves howled. Late, with the rising moon, returned the wains from the marshes, laden with briny hay that filled the air with its odor. Cheerily neighed the steeds, with dew on their manes and their fedlocks, while aloft on their shoulders the wooden and ponderous saddles, painted with brilliant dyes, and adorned with tassels of crimson, nodded in bright array, like hollyhocks heavy with blossoms. Patiently stood the cows meanwhile, and yielded their udders unto the milkmaid's hand, whilst loud and in regular cadence into the sounding pails the foaming streamlets descended. Lowing of cattle and peals of laughter were heard in the farmyard, echoed back by the barns. Anon they sank into stillness, heavily closed. With a jarring sound, the valves of the barn doors rattled the wooden bars, and all for a season was silent. Indoors, warm by the wide-mouthed fireplace, idly the farmer sat in his elbow chair and watched how the flames and the smoke wreaths struggled together like foes in a burning city. Behind him, nodding and mocking along the wall with gestures fantastic, darted his own huge shadow and vanished away into darkness. Faces, clumsily carved in oak, on the back of his armchair laughed in the flickering light, and the pewter plates on the dresser caught and reflected the flame as shields of armies the sunshine. Fragments of song the old man sang, and carols of Christmas, such as at home in the olden time his fathers before him sang in their Norman orchards and bright Burgundian vineyards. Close at her father's side was the gentle Evangeline seated, spinning flax for the loom that stood in the corner behind her. Silent awhile were its treadles, at rest was its diligent shuttle, while the monotonous drone of the wheel, like the drone of a bagpipe, followed the old man's songs and united the fragments together, as in a church, when the chant of the choir at intervals ceases, footfalls are heard in the aisles, or words of the priest at the altar. So, in each pause of the song, with measured motion the clock clicked. Thus as they sat, there were footsteps heard, and, suddenly lifted, sounded the wooden latch, and the door swung back on its hinges. Benedict knew by the hob-nailed shoes it was Basil the blacksmith, and by her beating heart Evangeline knew who was with him. "Welcome," the farmer exclaimed, as their footsteps paused on the threshold. "Welcome, Basil, my friend. Come, take thy place on the settle close by the chimney side, which is always empty without thee. Take from the shelf overhead thy pipe and the box of tobacco. Never so much thyself art thou as when through the curling smoke of the pipe or the forge thy friendly and jovial face gleams round and red as the harvest moon through the mist of the marshes." Then, with a smile of content, thus answered Basil the blacksmith, taking with easy air the accustomed seat by the fireside: "Benedict Bellefontaine, thou hast ever thy jest and thy ballad. Ever in cheerfullest mood art thou, when others are filled with gloomy forebodings of ill, and see only ruin before them. happy art thou, as if every day thou hadst picked up a horseshoe. Pausing a moment to take the pipe that Evangeline brought him, and with a coal from the embers had lighted, he slowly continued. 4 days now are past since the English ships at their anchors ride in the Gaspereau's mouth, with their cannon pointed against us. What their design may be is unknown, but all are commanded on the morrow to meet in the church, where His Majesty's mandate will be proclaimed as law in the land. Alas, in the meantime many surmises of evil alarm the hearts of the people. Then made answer the farmer, perhaps some friendlier purpose brings these ships to our shores. Perhaps the harvests in England by untimely rains or untimelier heat have been blighted, and from our bursting barns they would feed their cattle and children. Not so thinketh the folk in the village, said warmly the blacksmith, shaking his head as in doubt. Then, heaving a sigh, he continued, Louisbourg is not forgotten, nor Beausejour, nor Port Royal. Many already have fled to the forest, and lurk on its outskirts, waiting with anxious hearts the dubious fate of tomorrow. Arms have been taken from us, and warlike weapons of all kinds. Nothing is left but the blacksmith's sledge and the scythe of the mower. Then with a pleasant smile made answer the jovial farmer, safer are we unarmed, in the midst of our flocks and our cornfields, safer within these peaceful dikes, besieged by the ocean, than our fathers in forts, besieged by the enemy's cannon. Fear no evil, my friend, and tonight may no shadow of sorrow fall on this house and hearth, for this is the night of the contract. Built are the house and the barn. The merry lads of the village strongly have built them and well, and, breaking the glebe round about them, filled the barn with hay and the house with food for a twelvemonth. René Leblanc will be here anon, with his papers and inkhorn. Shall we not then be glad, and rejoice in the joy of our children? As apart by the window she stood, with her hand in her lover's, blushing Evangeline heard the words that her father had spoken, and, as they died on his lips, the worthy notary entered. 3. Bent like a laboring oar that toils in the surf of the ocean, bent but not broken by age was the form of the notary public. Shocks of yellow hair, like the silken floss of the maize, hung over his shoulders. His forehead was high, and glasses with horn bows sat astride on his nose, with a look of wisdom supernal. Father of 20 children was he, and more than 100 children's children rode on his knee, and heard his great watch tick. 4 long years in the times of the war had he languished a captive, suffering much in an old French fort as the friend of the English. Now, though warrior grown, without all guile or suspicion, ripe in wisdom was he, but patient and simple and childlike. He was beloved by all, and most of all by the children, for he told them tales of the loup-garou in the forest, and of the goblin that came in the night to water the horses, and of the white leditch, the ghost of a child who unchristened died, and was doomed to haunt unseen the chambers of children. And how on Christmas Eve the oxen talked in the stable, and how the fever was cured by a spider shut up in a nutshell, and of the marvelous powers of 4-leaved clover and horseshoes, with whatsoever else was written the lore of the village. Then uprose from his seat by the fireside Basil the blacksmith, knocked from his pipe the ashes, and slowly extending his right hand, Father Leblanc, he exclaimed, thou hast heard the talk in the village, and, perchance, canst tell us some news of these ships and their errand. Then with modest demeanor made answer the notary public, gossip enough have I heard, in sooth, yet am never the wiser, and what their errand may be I know not better than others, yet am I not of those who imagine some evil intention brings them here, for we are at peace, and why then molest us? God's name, shouted the hasty and somewhat irascible blacksmith, must we in all things look for the how, and the why, and the wherefore? Daily injustice is done, and might is the right of the strongest, but, without heeding his warmth, continued the notary public, man is unjust, but God is just, and finally justice triumphs, and well I remember a story that often consoled me when as a captive I lay in the old French fort at Port Royal. This was the old man's favorite tale, and he loved to repeat it when his neighbors complained that any injustice was done them. Once in an ancient city, whose name I no longer remember, raised aloft on a column, a brazen statue of justice stood in the public square, upholding the scales in its left hand, and in its right a sword, as an emblem that justice presided over the laws of the land, and the hearts and homes of the people. Even the birds had built their nests in the scales of the balance, having no fear of the sword that flashed in the sunshine above them. But in the course of time the laws of the land were corrupted. Might took the place of right, and the weak were oppressed, and the mighty ruled with an iron rod. Then it chanced in a nobleman's palace that a necklace of pearls was lost, and ere long a suspicion fell on an orphan girl who lived as maid in the household. She, after form of trial condemned to die on the scaffold, patiently met her doom at the foot of the statue of justice. As to her father in heaven her innocent spirit ascended. Lo, o'er the city a tempest rose, and the bolts of the thunder smote the statue of bronze, and hurled in wrath from its left hand down on the pavement below the clattering scales of the balance, and in the hollow thereof was found the nest of a magpie, into whose clay-built walls the necklace of pearls was inwoven. Silenced, but not convinced, when the story was ended, the blacksmith stood like a man who fain would speak, but findeth no language. All his thoughts were congealed into lines on his face, as the vapors freeze in fantastic shapes on the window panes in the winter. Then Evangeline lighted the brazen lamp on the table, filled, till it overflowed, the pewter tankard with home-brewed nut-brown ale that was famed for its strength in the village of Grand Prix, while from his pocket the notary drew his papers and inkhorn, wrote with a steady hand the date and the age of the parties, naming the dower of the bride and flocks of sheep and cattle. Orderly all things proceeded, and duly and well were completed, and the great seal of the law was set like a sun on the margin. Then from his leathern pouch the farmer threw on the table 3 times the old man's fee in solid pieces of silver, and the notary rising and blessing the bride and the bridegroom, lifted aloft the tankard of ale and drank to their welfare. Wiping the foam from his lip, he solemnly bowed and departed, while in silence the others sat and mused by the fireside, till Evangeline brought the draught board out of its corner. Soon was the game begun. In friendly contention the old men laughed at each lucky hit or unsuccessful maneuver, laughed when a man was crowned, or a breach was made in the king row. Meanwhile apart, in the twilight gloom of a window's embrasure, sat the lovers, and whispered together, beholding the moon rise over the pallid sea and the silvery mist of the meadows. Silently one by one, in the infinite meadows of heaven, blossomed the lovely stars, the forget-me-nots of the angels. Thus was the evening passed. Anon the bell from the belfry rang out the hour of 9, the village curfew, and straightway rose the guests and departed, and silence reigned in the household. Many a farewell word and sweet good night on the doorstep lingered long in Evangeline's heart, and filled it with gladness. Carefully then were covered the embers that glowed on the hearthstone, and on the oaken stairs resounded the tread of the farmer. Soon with a soundless step the foot of Evangeline followed. Up the staircase moved a luminous space in the darkness, lighted less by the lamp than the shining face of the maiden. Silent she passed the hall, and entered the door of her chamber. Simple that chamber was, with its curtains of white, and its clothes press ample and high, on whose spacious shelves were carefully folded linen and woolen stuffs, by the hand of Evangeline woven. This was the precious dower she would bring to her husband in marriage, better than flocks and herds, being proofs of her skill as a housewife. Soon she extinguished her lamp, for the mellow and radiant moonlight streamed through the windows and lighted the room, till the heart of the maiden swelled and obeyed its power, like the tremulous tides of the ocean. Ah, she was fair, exceeding fair to behold, as she stood with naked snow-white feet on the gleaming floor of her chamber. Little she dreamed that below, among the trees of the orchard, waited her lover and watched for the gleam of her lamp and her shadow. Yet were her thoughts of him, and at times a feeling of sadness passed o'er her soul, as the sailing shade of clouds in the moonlight flitted across the floor and darkened the room for a moment, and, as she gazed from the window, she saw serenely the moon pass forth from the folds of a cloud, and one star follow her footsteps, as out of Abraham's tent young Ishmael wandered with Hagar. 4. Pleasantly rose next morn the sun on the village of Grand Prix. Pleasantly gleamed in the soft, sweet air the basin of Minas, where the ships, with their wavering shadows, were riding at anchor. Life had long been astir in the village, and clamorous labor knocked with its 100 hands at the golden gates of the morning. Now from the country around, from the farms and neighboring hamlets, came in their holiday dresses the blithe Acadian peasants. Many a glad good morrow and jocund laugh from the young folk made the bright air brighter, as up from the numerous meadows where no path could be seen but the track of wheels in the greensward, group after group appeared and joined or passed on the highway. Long ere noon, in the village all sounds of labor were silenced. Thronged were the streets with people, and noisy groups at the house doors sat in the cheerful sun, and rejoiced and gossiped together. Every house was an inn, where all were welcomed and feasted, for with this simple people, who lived like brothers together, all things were held in common, and what one had was another's. Yet under Benedict's roof hospitality seemed more abundant, for Evangeline stood among the guests of her father. Bright was her face with smiles, and words of welcome and gladness fell from her beautiful lips, and blessed the cup as she gave it. Under the open sky and the odorous air of the orchard, stripped of its golden fruit, was spread the feast of betrothal. There in the shade of the porch were the priest and the notary seated. There good Benedict sat, and sturdy Basil the blacksmith. Not far withdrawn from these, by the cider press and the beehives, Michael the fiddler was placed, with the gayest of hearts and of waistcoats. Shadow and light from the leaves alternately played on his snow-white hair as it waved in the wind, and the jolly face of the fiddler glowed like a living coal when the ashes are blown from the embers. Gaily the old man sang to the vibrant sound of his fiddle, Tous les bourgeois de Chartres, and Le Carillon de Dunkirk, and anon with his wooden shoes beat time to the music. Merrily, merrily whirled the wheels of the dizzying dances under the orchard trees and down the path to the meadows. Old folk and young together, and children mingled among them. Fairest of all the maids was Evangeline, Benedict's daughter. Noblest of all the youths was Gabriel, son of the blacksmith. So passed the morning away, and lo, with a summons sonorous sounded the bell from its tower, and over the meadows a drum beat. Thronged ere long was the church with men. Without, in the churchyard, waited the women. They stood by the graves, and hung on the headstones garlands of autumn leaves and evergreens fresh from the forest. Then came the guard from the ships, and marching proudly among them entered the sacred portal. With loud and dissonant clangor echoed the sound of their brazen drums from ceiling and casement. Echoed a moment only, and slowly the ponderous portal closed, and in silence the crowd awaited the will of the soldiers. Then uprose their commander, and spoke from the steps of the altar, holding aloft in his hands, with its seals, the royal commission. You are convened this day, he said, by his majesty's orders. Clement and kind has he been, but how you have answered his kindness, let your own hearts reply. To my natural make and my temper painful the task as I do, which to you I know must be grievous. Yet must I bow and obey and deliver the will of our monarch, namely, that all your lands, and dwellings, and cattle of all kinds forfeited be to the crown, and that you yourselves from this province be transported to other lands. God grant you may dwell there ever as faithful subjects, a happy and peaceable people. Prisoners now I declare you, for such is his majesty's pleasure, as, when the air is serene in the sultry solstice of summer, suddenly gathers a storm, and the deadly sling of the hailstones beats down the farmer's corn in the field and shatters his windows, hiding the sun, and strewing the ground with thatch from the house roofs. Bellowing fly the herds, and seek to break their enclosures. So on the hearts of the people descended the words of the speaker. Silent a moment they stood in speechless wonder, and then rose louder and ever louder a wail of sorrow and anger, and, by one impulse moved, they madly rushed to the doorway. Vain was the hope of escape, and cries and fierce imprecations rang through the house of prayer, and high o'er the heads of the others rose, with his arms uplifted, the figure of Basil the blacksmith, as, on the stormy sea, a spar is tossed by the billow. Flushed was his face and distorted with passion, and wildly he shouted, Down with the tyrants of England, we never have sworn them allegiance. Death to these foreign soldiers, who seize on our homes and our harvests. More he fain would have said, but the merciless hand of a soldier smote him upon the mouth, and dragged him down to the pavement. In the midst of the strife and tumult of angry contention, lo, the door of the chancel opened, and Father Felician entered, with serious mien, and ascended the steps of the altar. Raising his reverend hand, with a gesture he ought to silence all that clamorous throng, and thus he spake to his people. Deep were his tones and solemn, in accents measured and mournful spake he, as, after the tocsin's alarum, distinctly the clock strikes. What is this that ye do, my children? What madness has seized you? 40 years of my life have I labored among you, and taught you, not in word alone, but in deed, to love one another. Is this the fruit of my toils, of my vigils and prayers and privations? Have you so soon forgotten all lessons of love and forgiveness? This is the house of the Prince of Peace, and would you profane it thus with violent deeds and hearts overflowing with hatred? Lo, where the crucified Christ from his cross is gazing upon you. See in those sorrowful eyes what meekness and holy compassion. Hark, how those lips still repeat the prayer, O Father, forgive them. Let us repeat that prayer in the hour when the wicked assail us. Let us repeat it now and say, O Father, forgive them. Few were his words of rebuke, but deep in the hearts of his people sank they, and sobs of contrition succeeded the passionate outbreak, while they repeated his prayer and said, O Father, forgive them. Then came the evening service. The tapers gleamed from the altar. Fervent and deep was the voice of the priest, and the people responded, not with their lips alone, but their hearts, and the Ave Maria sang they, and fell on their knees, and their souls, with devotion translated, rose on the ardor of prayer, like Elijah ascending to heaven. Meanwhile had spread in the village the tidings of ill, and on all sides wandered, wailing, from house to house the women and children. Long at her father's door Evangeline stood, with her right hand shielding her eyes from the level rays of the sun, that, descending, lighted the village street with mysterious splendor, and roofed each peasant's cottage with golden thatch, and emblazoned its windows. Long within had been spread the snow-white cloth on the table. There stood the wheaten loaf, and the honey fragrant with wild flowers. There stood the tankard of ale, and the cheese fresh brought from the dairy, and, at the head of the board, the great armchair of the farmer. Thus did Evangeline wait at her father's door, as the sun set through the long shadows of trees o'er the broad ambrosial meadows. Ah, on her spirit within a deeper shadow had fallen, and from the fields of her soul a fragrance celestial ascended. Charity, meekness, love, and hope, and forgiveness, and patience. Then, all forgetful of self, she wandered into the village, cheering with looks and words the mournful hearts of the women, as o'er the darkening fields with lingering steps they departed, urged by their household cares, and the weary feet of their children. Down sank the great red sun, and in golden, glimmering vapors veiled the light of his face, like the prophet descending from Sinai. Sweetly over the village the bell of the Angelus sounded. Meanwhile, amid the gloom, by the church Evangeline lingered. All was silent within, and in vain at the door and the windows stood she, and listened and looked, till, overcome by emotion, Gabriel, cried she aloud with tremulous voice, but no answer came from the graves of the dead, nor the gloomier grave of the living. Slowly at length she returned to the tenantless house of her father. Smoldered the fire on the hearth, on the board was the supper untasted. Empty and drear was each room, and haunted with phantoms of terror. Sadly echoed her step on the stair and the floor of her chamber. In the dead of the night she heard the disconsolate rain fall loud on the withered leaves of the sycamore tree by the window. Keenly the lightning flashed, and the voice of the echoing thunder told her that God was in heaven, and governed the world he created. Then she remembered the tale she had heard of the justice of heaven. Soothed was her troubled soul, and she peacefully slumbered till morning. 5. 4 times the sun had risen and set, and now on the 5th day cheerily called the cock to the sleeping maids of the farmhouse. Soon o'er the yellow fields, in silent and mournful procession, came from the neighboring hamlets and farms the Acadian women, driving in ponderous wains their household goods to the seashore, pausing and looking back to gaze once more on their dwellings, ere they were shut from sight by the winding road and the woodland. Close at their sides their children ran, and urged on the oxen, while in their little hands they clasped some fragments of playthings. Thus to the Gaspereau's mouth they hurried, and there on the sea beach piled in confusion lay the household goods of the peasants. All day long between the shore and the ships did the boats ply. All day long the wains came laboring down from the village. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was near to his setting, echoed far o'er the fields came the roll of drums from the churchyard. Thither the women and children thronged. On a sudden the church doors opened, and forth came the guard, and marching in gloomy procession followed the long imprisoned, but patient, Acadian farmers. Even as pilgrims who journey afar from their homes and their country sing as they go, and in singing forget they are weary and wayworn, so with songs on their lips the Acadian peasants descended down from the church to the shore amid their wives and their daughters. Foremost the young men came, and, raising together their voices, sang with tremulous lips a chant of the Catholic missions. Sacred heart of the Savior, O inexhaustible fountain, fill our hearts this day with strength and submission and patience. Then the old men, then as they marched, and the women that stood by the wayside joined in the sacred psalm, and the birds in the sunshine above them mingled their notes therewith, like voices of spirits departed. Halfway down to the shore Evangeline waited in silence, not overcome with grief, but strong in the hour of affliction. Calmly and sadly she waited, until the procession approached her, and she beheld the face of Gabriel pale with emotion. Tears then filled her eyes, and, eagerly running to meet him, clasped she his hands, and laid her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "Gabriel, be of good cheer, for if we love one another, nothing, in truth, can harm us, whatever mischances may happen." Smiling she spake these words, then suddenly paused, for her father saw she slowly advancing. Alas, how changed was his aspect! Gone was the glow from his cheek, and the fire from his eye, and his footstep heavier seemed with the weight of the heavy heart in his bosom. But with a smile and a sigh she clasped his neck and embraced him, speaking words of endearment where words of comfort availed not. Thus to the Gaspereau's mouth moved on that mournful procession. There disorder prevailed, and the tumult and stir of embarking busily plied the freighted boats, and in the confusion wives were torn from their husbands, and mothers, too late, saw their children left on the land, extending their arms with wildest entreaties. So unto separate ships were Basil and Gabriel carried, while in despair on the shore Evangeline stood with her father. Half the task was not done when the sun went down, and the twilight deepened and darkened around, and in haste the refluent ocean fled away from the shore, and left the line of the sand beach covered with waifs of the tide, with kelp and the slippery seaweed. Farther back in the midst of the household goods and the wagons, like to a gypsy camp or a leaguer after a battle, all escape cut off by the sea, and the sentinels near them lay encamped for the night. The houseless Acadian farmers, back to its nethermost caves retreated the bellowing ocean, dragging adown the beach the rattling pebbles, and leaving inland and far up the shore the stranded boats of the sailors. Then, as the night descended, the herds returned from their pastures. Sweet was the moist still air with the odor of milk from their udders. Lowing they waited, and long, at the well-known bars of the farmyard, waited and looked in vain for the voice and the hand of the milkmaid. Silence reigned in the streets. From the church no angelus sounded, rose no smoke from the roofs, and gleamed no lights from the windows. But on the shores meanwhile the evening fires had been kindled, built of the driftwood thrown on the sands from wrecks in the tempest. Round them shapes of gloom and sorrowful faces were gathered. Voices of women were heard, and of men, and the crying of children. Onward from fire to fire, as from hearth to hearth in his parish, wandered the faithful priest, consoling and blessing and cheering, like unto shipwrecked Paul on Miletus' desolate seashore. Thus he approached the place where Evangeline sat with her father, and in the flickering light beheld the face of the old man, haggard and hollow and wan, and without either thought or emotion, and as the face of a clock from which the hands have been taken. Vainly Evangeline strove with words and caresses to cheer him, vainly offered him food, yet he moved not, he looked not, he spake not, but with a vacant stare ever gazed at the flickering firelight. "Benedicite," murmured the priest in tones of compassion. More he fain would have said, but his heart was full, and his accents faltered and paused on his lips, as the feet of a child on the threshold, hushed by the scene he beholds, and the awful presence of sorrow. Silently, therefore, he laid his hand on the head of the maiden, raising his tearful eyes to the silent stars that above them moved on their way, unperturbed by the wrongs and sorrows of mortals. Then sat he down at her side, and they wept together in silence. Suddenly rose from the south a light, as in autumn the blood-red moon climbs the crystal walls of heaven, and o'er the horizon Titan-like stretches its 100 hands upon mountain and meadow, seizing the rocks and the rivers, and piling huge shadows together. Broader and ever broader it gleamed on the roofs of the village, gleamed on the sky and the sea, and the ships that lay in the roadstead. Columns of shining smoke uprose, and flashes of flame were thrust through their folds and withdrawn, like the quivering hands of a martyr. Then as the wind seized the gleeds and the burning thatch, and, uplifting, whirled them aloft through the air, at once from 100 housetops started the sheeted smoke with flashes of flame intermingled. These things beheld in dismay the crowd on the shore and on shipboard. Speechless at first they stood, then cried aloud in their anguish, "We shall behold no more our homes in the village of Grand Prix." Loud on the sudden the cocks began to crow in the farmyards, thinking the day had dawned, and anon the lowing of cattle came on the evening breeze, by the barking of dogs interrupted. Then rose a sound of dread, such as startles the sleeping encampments far in the western prairies or forests that skirt the Nebraska, when the wild horses affrighted sweep by with the speed of the whirlwind, or the loud bellowing herds of buffaloes rush to the river. Such was the sound that arose on the night as the herds and the horses broke through their folds and fences, and madly rushed o'er the meadows. Overwhelmed with the sight, yet speechless, the priest and the maiden gazed on the scene of terror that reddened and whitened before them, and as they turned at length to speak to their silent companion, lo, from his seat he had fallen, and stretched abroad on the seashore motionless lay his form, from which the soul had departed. Slowly the priest uplifted the lifeless head, and the maiden knelt at her father's side, and wailed aloud in her terror. Then in a swoon she sank, and lay with her head on his bosom. Through the long night she lay in deep, oblivious slumber, and when she woke from the trance, she beheld a multitude near her. Faces of friends she beheld that were mournfully gazing upon her, pallid, with tearful eyes, and looks of saddest compassion. Still the blaze of the burning village illumined the landscape, reddened the sky overhead, and gleamed on the faces around her, and like the day of doom it seemed to her wavering senses. Then a familiar voice she heard, as it said to the people, "Let us bury him here by the sea, when the happier season brings us again to our homes from the unknown land of our exile. Then shall his sacred dust be piously laid in the churchyard." Such were the words of the priest, and there in haste by the seaside, having the glare of the burning village for funeral torches, but without bell or book, they buried the farmer of Grand Prix. And as the voice of the priest repeated the service of sorrow, lo, with a mournful sound, like the voice of a vast congregation, solemnly answered the sea, and mingled its roar with the dirges. It was the returning tide, that afar from the waste of the ocean, with the first dawn of the day, came heaving and hurrying landward. Then recommenced once more the stir and noise of embarking, and with the ebb of the tide the ships sailed out of the harbor, leaving behind them the dead on the shore and the village in ruin.